India is a very diverse country, as you know. It has so many languages, it has so many religions, it has so many ethnic groups, it has so many diversities, cultural and otherwise, that it is, I think, the most diverse in the whole world. And yet, in the last 65 years, despite grave apprehensions as to whether India was to hold together, and immediately after, not immediately after, at the time of independence, also having undergone a partition, whether India was going to hold together at all, let alone as a democracy, was a question that was raised by many, including, and I've quoted him in my paper, Sir Winston Churchill. And the Governor General, the Viceroy of India, the last bit before Lord Mountbatten, talking of whether India would be able to hold together at all. Yet it is my belief that India has held together, and not only held together, but strengthened in its unity, because of the fact that it has moved and continued to move further towards democracy. And in this, our greatest achievement has been that we have not wavered. You have, of course, you would have heard of the criticism of India's democracy. We are often criticized that it slowed the pace of growth. We are often criticized in other ways. But I do believe, and I have been committed to this belief, that India's growth and her strength lies, in fact, in the fact that she is a democracy. Now, I myself have been associated with several steps in that evolutionary period. I was in the office of the then Prime Minister, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, when we discussed the idea of local self-government. The concept of Mahatma Gandhi, the idea of local self-government, a concept that was his. Now, this is what he believed the real Swaraj to be. Swaraj, you know, is the word that we have for self-government. The real Swaraj will come not by the regulation of authority by a few, but by the acquisition of capacity by all to resist authority when abused. Now, how this was to be done was, in his view, through Panchayati Raj, local self-government. And the Constitution of India itself describes the Panchayat as an instrument of self-government. Therefore, this was a move forward in this direction. It was a move to empower the people, and a move to give to all sections of the people, no matter what their creed, their religion, whatever, the feeling that in terms of their own village, their own town, they were part of the government. The government was accountable to them and answerable and transparent. And in this direction, India has moved towards an information revolution. Next. It started, of course, with the Constitution itself. The Constitution is the basis of our democracy, but in defining fundamental rights. But the Constitution itself was not enough. The economy was one which had a very huge section of its population well below the poverty line. And you will have heard, perhaps those who may have been following our recent debates in India, that the Planning Commission, India's Planning Commission, has recently come up with the figure of the poverty line having come down to 22%. Now, I would consider that 22% is too high a level of poverty for a country which aspires to be a world economic power as India does today. But even this figure has been criticized by the opposition almost universally as being not true and too low a figure, and that the poverty line actually is around 30%. Now, certainly, India has the largest number of poor people in the world. That, I think, is undisputed, whether the poverty line is 22% or 30%, because our population is so huge. And in that poverty, in that level below the poverty line, a rather high level is that of Muslims. And this is substantiated by the report, 2011 report, the Human Development Report of our Planning Commission, in which the Planning Commission has included the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, and the Muslims for the first time as among the excluded people. So, what is required? What is required then is what is described by the Right to Information Law. With all these freedoms of information opened up, what this Indian society decided, not only the Indian government, was that it needed to have a right to information law based on Section 19.1, Article 19.1a of the Constitution, which was the right to freedom of expression. And this is a definition which has been upheld by the Supreme Court of India. Next. This is how it is defined. Democracy requires an informed citizenry and transparency of information which are vital to its functioning and also to contain corruption, and to hold governments and their instrumentalities accountable to the government. Now you can imagine that these disparities which I spoke to you about, the excluded groups that I spoke to you about, how are they disadvantaged? How are they excluded? They're excluded, they're disadvantaged because they do not have access. They do not have information. They do not have access to the accountability of the government. The government is not answerable to them. Therefore, you needed a law by which government became answerable to all. In the meantime, place this in the context of world developments. The right to information is not only a development, something that was conjured up by Indians, it is part of a whole world development. And next, and the beauty of our law is that it has come when it has come, because it's drawn down on the developments that have taken place across the world. Sweden was a country which came up for the first time with an equivalent of a right to information. But Sweden drew upon old Confucian law from China. In China, it had never become real. The right to information was never real. But as a concept, it already existed there. And Sweden, which as you can imagine, in the year 1776, was not a vibrant economic or developed economic country. It was a backward country, it was a poor country, but aspiring to develop. And there is where it brought this in. Now this, I've given you a short history of how the right to information became popular, but 1776 was fine. It's only in the 20th century that the right to information, the freedom of information as it's described, started becoming what was described as a characteristic of democracy. But then also Western democracy, not really Eastern democracy. We do know that UK, which sometimes prides itself on being one of the world's earliest democracies, modern democracies, only came up with such a law in the year 2000 and only enforced it in the year 2005. And any of you who have read Tony Blair's autobiography will know that he describes himself as a nincompoop for having brought this law, because he felt it eroded the authority of the government. And that's a theme that I will of course talk about, because I think we have got a lot of experience in India as to whether it has eroded the government or not eroded the government. The government itself, in the government itself there are two minds. There are those who feel that the government has been weakened by the right to information law. There are those who feel that no, the potential is there for strengthening. But I'll come to that. So you have these world developments, but the USA had the strongest law in this regard. They have got the characteristics which are there also in our law, because our law has drawn down on that, which is that it has made the government not only accountable, but those defaulting on this punishable. No other law had this before. Disciplinary action is mandated against officials who have wrongfully given information. Pakistan had come up with an ordinance in 2002. But then India also had an equivalent freedom of information law in 2002, which was never enforced. Our law, our present law, was one only which was actually implemented in 2005. And unlike England, which gave itself 5 years between passing the law and actually implementing it, we gave ourselves only very few months. The law was passed in May 2005 and enforced in October 2005. And that period in between was supposed to be provided for preparing the government, appointing the commission and so on, preparing the government for the enforcement of the law. Of course, as bureaucracies do, I expect that yours is no different to ours. No such preparation was made. So when the law was actually enforced in 2011, the government had not really. Then it started making the appointments of Chief Information Commissioner and so on. So this is how this whole movement has evolved. But today I can say, with a degree of confidence, that the right to information is regarded as a characteristic of a democracy. For too long, democracy has been felt that whenever you have elections, you have a democracy. But no, it may not be the right to information, but certainly transparency and accountability are a characteristic of democracy. And I can say this with the fullest confidence. I've also had occasion to discuss this in some detail with the Chinese ambassador in Delhi, who in fact, when I was sitting next to him at a table in a function in the Pakistan embassy, in fact, when I told him that when I introduced myself and I said I was Chief Information Officer, he talked about how he felt that our law was in fact highly progressive and was the answer to bringing greater accountability and transparency in governance. Whether it has worked in that regard inside India is another question, which I will come to. But the objective of this law certainly are these two qualities, transparency and accountability. Why? Because the law on which this has been formed this is what I've given a quote from Barack Hussein Obama when I mentioned the fact that America is the most advanced in terms of the right to information law. He himself, in his speech as president, in his first speech to the administration, talked about the fact that accountability is in the interest of the government and the citizenry alike. It is not something that is against the government. It helps to strengthen the government. And this is something that I quote repeatedly when I make my presentations inside India, inside the country, because, as I mentioned, there are those within the government in India who feel that this is weakening government. The objective cannot be to weaken government. And the answer to that will probably come from the next ruling of the Supreme Court of India. In this case, State of UP versus Raj Narayan. Some of you may have heard of this case. Raj Narayan was a member of a party called the Samajwadi Party, and he had challenged Mrs. Indira Gandhi in the elections. In 1975, he claimed that he had won the election, and he challenged her election before the Supreme Court. And this was the Supreme Court, of course, gave its decision. As you know, it gave its decision against Mrs. Gandhi. Then after that, you know the history of India. But that's not the question. The decision here was that in a government of responsibility like ours, where all agents of the public must be responsible for their conduct, there can be but few secrets. The people of this country have a right to know every public act and everything that is done in a public way by their public functionaries. To cover with a veil of secrecy the common routine business is not in the interest of the public. And in this, he was, as you can see, the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, was inspired by the quote of Justice Brandeis, which President Obama had quoted in the quotation just before this, that sunlight is the best of disinfectants. So this was the basis of our law, and the law itself, when it was passed by Parliament, the Prime Minister, when presenting this law, had this to say. Next. In this, I will draw your attention only to the last line, which talks about ensure that all records are appropriate are computed. And the era shall bring the common man's concern to the heart of all processes of governance, an era which will truly fulfill the hopes of the founding fathers of our republic. What were those hopes? Those hopes I read out to you were the hopes of the father of the nation as to how the leaders who were to replace the rulers under colonial rule would become accountable and answerable. So the question is, how do we define in our law what is information next? This is information. This is hugely wide, as you can imagine. And I will especially draw your attention to the last line. All the other characteristics are there, including logbooks and so on. But it says any private body which can be accessed by a public authority under any other law for the time being in force. And a country like ours, which has passed through an era of being a welfare state, there is hardly anything that even the private sector does not have to report to the government. And therefore, the extent of this act is very wide. The full extent has not yet been actually explored. And you do know that in the recent past, I suppose you must have read, because it's created a bit of news all over the world, is that the Information Commission has held that political parties also come under this law. And they have to be as accountable and as transparent as any government department. And this is something that has been widely disputed. The government is coming up with an amendment to keep the political parties out of the jurisdiction of this law. But on the other hand, civil society is stoutly opposed to this idea of covering the political parties under this law. The key concepts, next. The key concepts of our law in India are transparency and accountability, we have mentioned to you, and the right of any citizen to access information, the corresponding duty of government to meet the request, except exempted information. It is recognized that certain information cannot be given. And I'll describe to you later what is that information which cannot be given in detail. I think you will agree that is a universal concept as to what can be given and what can't be given. The principle here is that since it is the public which pays the government, or which gives through which the resources are raised, which run government, therefore the public has the right to ask the government to give it any information that it holds, provided that it does not compromise security or in any way weaken the government. And how it can weaken the government, that I will describe to you when I come to that later. So it is the duty of government to make this information available, but it is a responsibility on all the citizens. On the citizens, the NGOs, the media, to see that that information is used responsibly. And I say that with the fullest force based on the experience in India, because this has not always been the case. Unfortunately, it has been looked upon by many in civil society as a means through which it has made government answerable, but they have not recognized that it has also made them accountable.